So here we are talking about the language game while these deer just parade behind me. I mean, literally parading behind me. The language game is a made up system. It's a cultural language system where words don't really mean anything. And a great example of these deer are insane. A great example of the language game is cuss words. So when little kids come home from school and they say, "Why can't I say the F word?" I don't really understand it. Their perception of that break between reality and language is actually more accurate than your own. And so when you say, "No, honey, you shouldn't say those words," and the kid says, "Why?" And you say, "I don't know why." Right, because it's a made up thing in the language game. I'm not saying tell your kids to say that word in school. I get there's consequences. I've always said the language game consequences are greater than the consequences in reality. So you do have to abide by some of these systems. The deer are gone. You do have to abide by some of these systems, but I want you to see just how cuss words and their made up implications are a great example of how the language game functions. Thanks for shopping.
So you can see some of these deer behind me are acting like fools. I don't know if you can see them really, but they're kind of right there. Right there. Let me point at them. So we're talking today about the language game, like we always are. And we're talking about how definitions within the language game contain multiple interpretations for your brain, which is to say, a word might literally mean something, but it also has an emotional consequence for you. And that's what the language game really does. It does change some of these definitions, but it really promotes a kind of emotional, non-reasoned, non-logical presentation or realism for you. So let me give you a perfect example. The word selfish, Ayn Rand's favorite word. I don't know what that deer's doing. Ayn Rand's favorite word. So what this does is it does give you a literal definition. You think, oh, self-focused. Yeah, and you're kind of right, kind of not right because you're dumb. Not as dumb as me, but you're dumb. But it also gives you an emotional reaction. So when you hear the word selfish, you actually react viscerally and emotionally. And what that does is it gives you a negative feeling. So that kind of feeling that comes out of you colors your definition of the word, which is to say, it covers over the literal definition and it changes the literal definition. It infuses that definition with an emotionality, which means it's a negative self focusing. Oh, it's a bad word. Oh, it changes what I might scientifically, rationally interpret and makes it something with a depth, with a real component, which means you have a bad reaction to it. And if someone says, hey, that person's selfish, you don't think, oh, they're so focused. I get it. Let's analyze that scientifically. No, you think, oh, what an asshole. You see what I mean about these words in the language game? And that's a natural process, but you got to be careful when they're colored and infused with a culture that doesn't really understand it's doing it and doesn't have a basis for that understanding. And that's the depth of the language game. And that's an intro like everything is, and I hope that makes sense. Thanks for shopping.
I have to redo my third part of my montage about the language game. And there is a chupacabra standing right there in the woods. I don't know if you can see him. Maybe I'll zoom in on the video when I edit it. I actually did another video where he was standing right behind me and I forgot to hook up my audio. So I had to delete it. See, he's moving right now. There he goes, running through the woods. See him trying to get away from me because he's mad at me. We're talking about the language game. We're talking about the third part, kind of wrap it up, talk about Ludwig Wittgenstein, whatever the hell his name is. We're talking about his interpretation of the language game versus my interpretation. So if you understand him, maybe this will help you. And I'll also say I got accused of a lot of misinformation. So maybe if you know him better than me, put it down in the comments what he really meant. I'm going to tell you this little story while the chupacabra just vanishes into the nether. When I was a professor, before I got fired for the 15th time, they brought in AI people into the classroom with little laptops, and they were trying to determine how much misinformation we were actually giving the students. And they kind of created a scale from their data that they used, comparing a lot of the data points we brought up in our lectures. And of the whole university, 50,000 teachers, I was ranked number one, worst misinformation. 97% of the content of my lectures and data were considered I just made that whole thing up. Just made the whole thing up. I make this shit up all the time. That's misinformation right there. But I'm kind of making a point that's true. Ludwig Wittgenstein, whatever his name is, thought in the latter part of his career that the language game defined how we speak. And as an analytic philosopher, what he meant by that, and this is what the critics are accusing him of, is that language is subjectivized, which means in some sense, if I'm right, there is no real objective language because language changes because of your participation in your culture. Your culture changes those words, changes those concepts in your mind to fit a kind of cultural system, which is relativized, which means based on context, your mind, where you are presently, where you live at a certain time, and that changes over time. What I'd like to say is different about my interpretation of the language game is that there's a subjective and an objective game, two of them. Wittgenstein's right. We're all influenced by culture. That's subjective. It's based on us and it's based on where we are in time. But I'd also like to say that that's the wrong way to do it and that there's a right way to do it. The right way to do language is to understand this context of the subjective language game and transcend it. It's a way of understanding that words do have more objective, true components, and you build that into your language. And you do that so that you don't sound like you are just a product of your culture. So, in a sense, I'm saying the opposite that Wittgenstein is saying. He's saying you're limited and subjectivized by language and you can't transcend it. I'm saying you should transcend it and you can come to a better understanding of how language functions in the real world in a common sense, critical way, as objective, as something you could easily translate with objective components to someone else. And that's what I'm saying. And that's how it differs. I hope that makes sense. I hope a chupacabra attacks you later. Bye. Thanks for shopping.